Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to another installment of our suicide justice series. Um, this has been a really remarkable year of conversations with folks doing research at such different parts of the world across different scales of engagement around suicide justice, and people coming with such diverse lived experiences and scholarly perspectives. And really, the purpose of this gathering is to put us into intentional conversation, um, responding to Kristen Cardon's provocation in her article Suicide Justice, which situates the research and societal responses to the issue of suicide in interlocking struggles and movements for social, economic, environmental, gender, and other forms of justice, and inviting us to think about our plural visions of justice, and how they might inform meaningful research and practice in a world where suicide exists. And so I'm really delighted today to introduce to you watching live and to those of you who will watch this virtually, a dear colleague, professor, now ex-professor, Dr. China Mills. Um, and just really, many of you will know of China's work from a variety of contexts. But I first came to know your work, China, through your work on critical interrogations of psychiatry, thinking about mental health in global contexts. And, as an Indigenous scholar, looking for theoretical and applied work that took seriously the invitation to think decolonially about our work. And it was really interesting to sort of like follow that work into your work at the intersections of premature death and thinking about the different meanings and valences of suicide in a world shaped increasingly by neoliberalism and austerity. And I'm just so delighted that we're able to sit with you today, and to learn from this work. And yeah, thank you for heeding our invitation. And yeah, I'm really delighted to welcome you to this conversation. And yeah, I know that I could just go on and on about introductions of your many accomplishments, but I think actually what I will say this before passing it over to you is that, as a scholar and as an academic, it's rare to actually find and experience people who put people at the center of their work. And sometimes I would say the university is not always the most humanizing space. But I actually have a vivid recollection of showing up at that conference in Perth, where we first met in person at the Critical Suicidology gathering, that network gathering in Perth, as a relative newcomer to that space. Um, and I remember the warmth and welcome you provided me in that space. And I just want to say thank you for that, because that space has really become a home space for me in my work. But I also think that's exactly the kind of scholarly community we so desperately need in times like this, that not just says like, oh, we're welcoming people, but actually practices that hospitality and generosity of spirit with each other in the work that we do. So I want to just express my gratitude for that, China, and also, yeah, just welcome you to this conversation.
Oh, what a lovely introduction. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. And it's lovely to reconnect after so long. It's a real honour to be here. And I was just saying to Jeffrey, I've never been able to make the talks in person, as it were, live, but I've watched nearly all of the recordings after the sessions, and they're brilliant. So for folks who haven't watched the others, please do, because I've learned so much from them, and it's just a wonderful resource. So thank you for all the work organising and pulling this together, to Jeffrey and to Deanna. Yeah, so I suppose I'll do a little bit of an introduction, and I'll kind of work through the journey of this research, I suppose, and some of the findings around it. Okay. So I wanted to talk to you today about the Deaths by Welfare project, which is a project that I've led since 2021. Okay. And I've been actually researching, as Jeffrey hinted at, suicides and more like overall harms, I suppose, linked to kind of austerity and austerity policies in the UK since probably about 2015, 2016, which is quite late in a way, because as I'll show, there were a lot of people's suicides predating that. Kind of from about 2010 onwards, but some earlier as well. And actually doing this work has been a really important part of me eventually leaving academia and becoming head of research instead at a small but mighty kind of more grassroots organisation, Healing Justice London. Yeah, so the journey of this project is quite a personal journey, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. And just to tell you a little bit about Healing Justice, so we are building kind of capacity, skills and infrastructures to support community-led health and healing, okay? Really explicit about a vision for the future that includes liberation from structural and systemic oppressions. And to get there, we're prototyping what we're calling life-affirming infrastructures that support community health and healing. And I suppose it's my real honour then to be part of a small but again, brilliant research team at Healing Justice and a growing research team that are really thinking about what life-affirming research can look like, might look like, where are concrete examples of where it's already happening, I suppose, and thinking about what does research look like that centres designs and prototypes around people's inherent safety, dignity and belonging, as well as thinking about research that's by and for social movements and oriented towards justice. So it's been wonderful to have the Deaths by Welfare project at an organisation like Healing Justice, and I really believe it would have been incredibly difficult to have it at a university. And I had a bit of a crossover where I was kind of partly at university, partly at Healing Justice doing the work, and it was tricky. So I'm happy to talk more about the kind of practicalities of that, but it feels like very much the right place to be doing the research, and I think that's an important thing to acknowledge as part of that context. Okay, so before I say any more, I just want to always start these whenever I talk about the project to talk about prioritising care. I think there's something about this work where there's a real balance with not infantilizing people. So people can and should be able to choose what they want to listen to and engage with and, you know, be held in doing that. But things can also kind of jump out at us in ways that we weren't expecting. So I think it's important to hold people, I suppose, as we sort of do this work. So in that sense, I will be talking today about quite brutal systems, so state systems with some corporations thrown in, that essentially make life for quite a large number of people. And today I'll particularly be talking about disabled people that make life unlivable. I will always understand people's deaths within a context of injustice in which they take place. And I will mention some people's names. I think it's an important way to honour them, but I won't talk about any specific details of methods of people's suicide, though you can find that information if you search for those people's names. So, but I usually choose not to include that in the work. But yeah, and just also to say there are so many people whose names I won't say because I haven't got time, and also whose names we don't know, but who have died because of a lot of the context that I'll talk about. It just feels important to honour and hold those folks with us too, just because we don't necessarily name them or know all of their names. So just take part in a way that honours how you're feeling and prioritises your care. A good thing about this also being recorded is that you can pause it and come back to it, or not come back to it if that's your choice. And there are some resources on the final slide, and I can share the slides that I hope might be useful for folks if you need them. So the Deaths by Welfare project investigates the links between the UK welfare system and people's deaths, including deaths by suicide, by centering kind of learning and expertise of those most impacted by welfare state violence, so especially disabled people and bereaved families. And the whole project has been co-created with disabled people. So, deaths by welfare, I suppose what we've tried to do, and I'll talk a lot more about this, is use the process of documenting evidence to build cross movement solidarity. So, through connecting people with lived experiences of, including families bereaved, by different but connected forms of state violence. So, I'm talking about a lot of what I'll talk about now is when I say the welfare system, I'm referring to kind of disability benefits, I suppose. But there are so many connections to other forms of state violence. And obviously, the welfare system also means something much bigger than that. There's so many crossovers into what's happening in mental health, in housing, in child welfare, etc., etc. So please kind of hold those as I talk about them. So we hold with care and complexity people's different dreams of justice, and I'll talk about some quite different understandings of justice today. We, and I say this, perhaps I should say I, because I'm not sure everybody would agree with that, that's been involved would agree with some of what I'm saying, and that's what's nice about the project. But many of us are non-reformist because we know how harm is designed into systems. It's a feature, not a bug, and that's something I'll talk quite a lot about shortly. And we aim with this work to co-create life-affirming systems with disabled people, and the analysis developed through lived experience at the heart. And this, there'll be artwork and various things throughout because we've worked a lot with artists on the project. And this piece here says deaths by welfare, but also has the names of many of the folks who've died written in the bigger letters. And that's artwork that we commissioned by Zita Holben. So there's loads of pieces to the Deaths by Welfare project, quite messy in a sort of splendid way. And I can't talk about all of them today, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions about them. And please do have a look on our website and on the Healing Justice website if you want to know more. But one of the core things I'll talk about is we've created a timeline. And I'll explain what I mean by that, but it's kind of a massive database, I suppose, of very different kinds of evidence which show the sort of cumulative harm of a lot of welfare policy in the UK since about 2008, but we go back a lot further than that before that to look at the conditions that sort of set the scene, I suppose, for what's called welfare reform to come into being. The project's also had conversations, interviews, focus groups, etc., with probably over 50 disabled people who are activists. And that has really, informed our kind of strategy, process, and accountability. We have a series of podcasts, interviewing and speaking with people with lived experience. We've worked with a lot of artists and done many exhibitions, etc. And the work is a really key part of Healing Justice London's wider kind of life-affirming research programme. Okay. So I thought what I would do is just start off with some of the very key learnings from the project, because then if you have to leave, you've heard the main bit, or if I don't end up finishing it because I've got too many slides, then you kind of know what some of the key pieces are, I suppose, to the project and where I'm coming from a little bit. So one of those is that disproportionately distributed harm and premature deaths targeting racialised, low-income and disabled people is a feature of the welfare state, not a bug. The state frames certain groups of people as a burden, and that framing has, in the UK anyway, but I'm sure in other places, has shifted historically. So some folks are framed as a burden on the economy, and that often gets translated into them being seen as undeserving of welfare and care. And that provides a sort of Gina B. Kim, in fact, in Cripping the Welfare State, talks about that. Cripping the Welfare Queen talks about how this is like a cover story, I suppose. And that cover story justifies dismantling social safety nets and diverting public resources away from poor people, perhaps especially racialised and disabled people. And it renders those folks as disposable then to mass disablement and to premature death. It's also really important, this burden piece, because feeling like a burden because you've been told you are a burden by the state seems to be a key pattern when you look at people's accounts of their suicides. So if you look in suicide notes or the way that families talk about folks who have died by suicide, talking about not wanting to feel like a burden. And that burden piece is one of the reasons why we always, I suppose, through the project have learned it's really important to always assume that the first audience for this project are the people that the research is with and about, I suppose. So instead of kind of trying to shock people into change, if that ever even happens, we've always assumed, or we've learned to assume, that the first people we're speaking to on this project are disabled people who have experience of the welfare system. And in doing that, it's really important to have key messages that no one is a burden, no one should be defined by their relationship to work. Your dignity and worth are non-negotiable, and that this is part of research that affirms dignity, safety, and belonging for those folks who are involved. I think a key way that we've done this is that even though this is called Deaths by Welfare and it is about collecting evidence of people's deaths and how that's connected to welfare policy, we've always centered that work in a story of resistance. So in the kind of powerful challenges from those deemed to be burdens. So in this instance, disabled people, but that crosses over with folks who are asylum seekers, with bereaved families, people who use the mental health system, etc., demanding government accountability and really visioning justice. And that might be, and is often both, within and beyond the state. And disabled people's knowledge and practices of care often then counter the infrastructural abandonment of the state while building alternative infrastructures that recognise interdependence and insist on the inherent value of all of our body minds. And here you might see there's a strong kind of strand of disability justice coming through and explicitly designed into our project. So today I'm going to talk a bit about how we made the timeline and the kind of process around that. I'm going to talk about some of our learnings, and I'm going to talk about the creativity and also the tensions within some movement organising around welfare reform and suicide. Okay, you can hear my little baby crying in the background, but she's with her grandma, so hopefully it'll be all right. So I'm going to focus on evidence, slow violence, mistakes or deaths by design, and justice. And I'm going to talk briefly about each one. All of these things I could spend days talking to you about, so I'm not doing them justice in a way, but I just wanted to give you a taste of the project. So a big part of this work has been co-creating what we've called a timeline. You could call it a living archive. It is a living document. It could be a database. And it's been co-created by me with John Pring, who runs Disability News Service. He's a disabled journalist. And we've had input from just some amazing disabled activists. So people like Ellen Clifford from Disabled People Against Cuts, or DPAC, which is a really key, a key group, I would say here, absolutely creatively and tirelessly kind of battling the violence of austerity and of welfare reform, which continues today, with Dolly Sen, who's a wonderful activist and artist, and Rick Burgess, also part of DPAC and co-founder of the Well Petition, and Nick Dilworth, who was a welfare rights expert, and many, many other people. And the timeline is made up of about 500 entries. It goes from, I think, actually before the 70s, but into 2022. And it spans when it was a big Google Doc, 350 pages, and now it's a website. And John and I, with some of the people mentioned before, made a kind of massive Google Doc of it, basically. And then we made that available for people, and people sent us lots of feedback, which we then used to change it. And then we created, with a brilliant group called Access Power Visibility Collective, and a website. And I'll show you a little bit of it in a minute. But why make the timeline, I think, is an important, what kind of motivated us to do it. And it was very much our involvement with a lot of disabled people's activism. There was a kind of ask and desire for something like a database or an archive timeline, which was like a place where you could really kind of see all the evidence of how welfare reform was killing people, basically. And from 2010, really, disabled people had started to warn of the harms of welfare reform. And by welfare reform, I mean a kind of series of intersecting policies that are rooted in conditionality and punishment and are often justified or part of a wider sort of austerity regime. And disabled people have been particularly demonized and framed as being undeserving and playing the system in this kind of austere framing. So austerity is thought to have caused an additional 335,000 deaths in Great Britain between 2012 and 2019. And there are so many different estimates, and I'll talk about a couple of them, of how many suicides by disabled people are linked to welfare reform or caused by welfare reform and wider austerity. I am not, though, and it's a conscious choice, going to spend ages going through that kind of data with you, because I would rather centre the sort of resistance, I suppose, of disabled folks in this, rather than, there's something I find it is important, and I've done it lots of times before, but something also quite unsettling about constantly repeating those harms and those deaths. All of that information is available. And I think it's time to kind of tell a bit of a different story in some ways. It's not, sadly, an archive in the sense of that these things were historical and they're now great. It's very much ongoing. Loads of the things that we've traced, the trends in policy, the framing of people as undeserving, etc., the obsession with getting people into work, really continues. So our current government have just announced a plan to cut 5 billion from disability benefits. And they're called benefits, but actually they're life-saving entitlements for a lot of people. And I think benefits sounds quite glib sometimes and doesn't do justice to what they mean to folks. So what we wanted to do was, we were conscious that there was tons of evidence, and I mean like freedom of information requests and responses to the government, internal documents from the Department for Work and Pensions, or the DWP, which is the government department that administers welfare in the UK, prevention of future deaths reports, all of this evidence. And it was all hidden in different places, often public, but quite hard to find. We wanted to bring it all into one place so that it created a tool that people could use, a resource that people could use if they wanted to. And most importantly, because it would allow us to start to see patterns. Whereas often what happens is when people's deaths are acknowledged, which is rare, and they're treated as individual and patterns, it's not possible to see patterns with other people's deaths. And so a big part of that for us was documenting the strategies used over time by the Department for Work and Pensions and the government more broadly to deny accountability. So with Access Power Visibility Collective, we created this website. Do have a look if you're interested. It's at just deathsbywelfare.org. And it is a mega thing. It's a mega resource, I suppose, and database. What it looks like, so one of the things we really wanted to do was make it as accessible as possible. It's still got some way to go. For example, it's not all translated into sign language, for example, which we would have loved. But there are lots of other ways it is accessible, and it's particularly, we've thought about distress, I suppose, so you can actually, in the access settings, kind of set filters in terms of if you want a content warning around people's deaths or when suicide is mentioned, etc. But what it allows you to do in the searches is pull out patterns, I suppose, in things. So for example, when you look at the timeline, you can pull out and see here just a tiny fraction of people who died in 2013 around linked to particular policies and welfare reforms. And I think in doing this, it really starts to hit home the sheer scale of harm. And it also, I hope, in some ways honours each person, those that can be named, those that we know about, because there's a real tension, I think, in holding how do we talk about scale of harm and also really remembering each person's life. And so you can see here, in the space of sort of less than a month, really, three people as deaths were found to be linked to various different welfare policies, including then coroners, for example, in the case of David Barr, a coroner saying that, particular policies may have been a trigger leading to their suicide. But as I said, so resistance is also really part of the timeline, and we wanted to make sure that we kind of documented that all the way through, so that that's also a searchable way of using the timeline as a resource. And you can see here in 2010, and that's significant because welfare reform was kind of introduced in 2007 to 2008. In 2010, when some of the harms of it really started to become clear, we saw the formation of some of the key groups, most of which continue today, in terms of movement organising against austerity and the violence of the welfare system. So groups like DPAC, who I mentioned, or Mad Pride, or the Black Triangle Campaign, etc. And these have been really key groups, and we chart a lot of their actions, publications, things that they've done on the timeline alongside policies, etc., and coroners' findings. So I think there's a really key theme, I suppose, in the work around evidence. And I think, as I said, there's a real violence to constantly being asked to evidence how the welfare state harms and kills people. And it's a labour that has largely been done by and falls on disabled people, the very people hardest hit by this violence. And I think that comes on top of being made, disabled people being put in a position where they have to prove that they're disabled or chronically ill and prove that they're deserving of benefits, on top of then this other kind of evidence. I think it's also made us wonder, like, what does the documentation and repetition of harm serve? And this tension of repeating it over and over again in a context where we have very ableist framings of disabled people's death as inevitable anyway, and as lives not kind of worth living. That's the framing, that's the government framing. So how have disabled folks created evidence on their own terms? And I'm going to run through some of examples of this. There's so many. And the next slide has just a very small photo of somebody's suicide note, just to let you know as a content warning. So one of the ways that people leave and create evidence is through suicide notes. And there are quite a few examples where their suicide notes name the government or particular policies. And Stephanie Bottrell, a 53-year-old woman who died in 2013, is one of the people that said the only people to blame are the government, after her benefits were going to be reduced. And you can see Stephanie's name on this sort of placard that says benefit cuts are killing us. It's a really important part of a lot of disabled people's and allies activism to name people who have died and kind of do and honour people, give names, I suppose, to that violence. Not everybody leaves a note, but some people leave clues, if you like, or more than clues, around how the welfare system has harmed them through the circumstances of their death or other kind of messages. So Roy Curtis, who was found dead in his home in 2018, he'd been asked to attend a work capability assessment, which is an assessment around disability benefits, basically, to determine if you will be able to continue to receive disability benefits. And the work capability assessment has been massively associated with people's suicides. The Department for Work and Pensions had been warned repeatedly that forcing Roy into work was making him suicidal. After he was found, a whole load of letters were found in his flat, including the covering page of his capability for work questionnaire, where Roy had written, you can see on the screen in red letters, "This is when my nightmare began." And as I said, naming people, creating lists of people who've died has been a really big part of activism. And some of these photos are of banners and placards that do that labour. And these are photos by Paula Peters, who's a wonderful activist and photographer, and who's a big part of Disabled People Against Cuts, DPAC. Yeah, so another way that I suppose people have tried to create evidence, there's so many creative ways in this, um, is talked about by Rick Burgess, who's co-founder, amongst many things, of Manchester DPAC. So he says, as a population, we, as in disabled people, have been targeted. And when you target people, you dehumanize them. When you're a disregarded cohort, a hated demographic, you need to find allies that the oppressors haven't put on the blacklist because they've locked us out, they're ignoring us, and they're killing us. So how Rick and a whole group of people decided to do that was contact leading epidemiologists to evidence something that was already really clear to disabled people, that the work capability assessment, which I already mentioned, was making people suicidal. And that research found that between 2010 and 2013, the work capability assessment was associated with an additional 590 suicides. And it's interesting because you often hear, and I'd done this before, I'd cited that research, but I didn't know the story behind that research, and that it was actually disabled people that went to the epidemiologist and essentially commissioned the work, or certainly said there's something here that needs researching. So another really important example of disabled people's kind of labour in creating the evidence. And yet the government, UK government stance, as repeated by the spokespeople, press office, multiple times, is that we take the death of any claimant seriously. Where it's appropriate, we undertake reviews into individual cases, but we do not accept the argument of those who seek to politicise people's deaths by linking them inaccurately to welfare policy. So the stay, and a lot of the research I've done shows evidence of this, and so, and as from many other people, the state mobilizes mental health and the fact that suicide is inherently complex in order to deny accountability in the role that they play in producing suicidality. And I think what's really interesting, and this will be the only time I mention it, but is a lot of disabled activists use mental health in a really different way from that. So when they talk about mental health, it isn't often this kind of individualized version of mental health, which is sort of seen as always linked to suicide somehow, in a depoliticizing way. It's a much more politicized understanding of mental health. So another incredibly key way that folks have been part of documenting creating the evidence has been to file freedom of information requests, and there's basically been ongoing battles of these. So many people have filed them to find out more information about what the Department for Work and Pensions kind of knows and gets up to, I suppose. And John Pring at Disability News Service, who I work with so closely on this project and co-created the timeline with me, I think has sent over 25 of these just to find out about the reviews that the department does into people's deaths, and including people's suicides. And through the responses to those freedom of information requests, it's been found then that between 2014 and 2022, the government carried out approximately 260 reviews into the deaths of people claiming benefits. So redacted versions of some of those reviews identify policies as potentially life-threatening, and they give loads of recommendations. But they also show that the government has no system for tracking any of those recommendations and if they've actually been put into action or not. They've never made public whose deaths have been investigated. And in fact, most families of people who have died don't even know if there has been one of these reviews carried out into their loved one or not. So here I think it's really important to sort of take us into this, and this is difficult, and because I've done what I'm about to be slightly critical of many times, but we sometimes talk about like flaws and mistakes and problems in the system, okay? And at best, these kinds of reviews, or sometimes coroner's reports, prevention of future deaths reports, etc., will talk about flaws or mistakes that were a trigger in somebody's suicide, okay? So, for example, 28 problems were found with the Department for Work and Pensions and one of its private sector contractors, which is also a big issue in what I'm talking about, to have been the predominant factor and the only acute factor that led Philippa Day to take her own life in 2019 after her disability benefits were stopped. It took a coroner 2 hours to read out those 28 problems. Okay. Oh, I've clicked on it. Sorry, 1 second. Is that back?
We can see your browser at this moment, but
Can you?
Yeah, but it's actually still visible if
I don't know
I
how
can still see it
I
clearly.
can try and click out of it. I don't know how I've done that. Let me have another go. 1 second.
That's
Okay,
okay.
let's see if it opens up again. Now you can't see anything.
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
now we're back.
Thank
Thank
you. So the coroner concluded then that these problems were not individual errors, but that they were flaws. They were systemic flaws. And Philippa's sister Imogen Day, who's worked with us loads on the Deaths by Welfare project, and someone whom I'm an enormous fan, told us that Philippa knew what was happening to her. She knew it was systemic. Before she died, she told her sister that she knew the assessment system was going to kill her. She felt they were pressuring her to kill herself because they felt she didn't matter because she was disabled. Okay. So that it can be tricky to say flaws in a system, right? Because it's a big win actually to get those flaws even recognized, for example, in an inquest. But it also risks implying that the system is broken rather than functioning as it may have been designed to function. And there's a risk that flaws channel our energy into sort of correcting and reforming what is still a very violent system. Tweaks and reforms then in parts of the system might never be enough because the underlying logic and the kind of profitability of those systems creates conditions that devalue certain people's lives and kill people, partly through inciting people to kill themselves. But this can be tricky because I've often also used that language of flaws, right? And it depends who you're talking to. And yeah, there's a tension there, I think. And Ellen Clifford, who's a member of the steering committee for DPAC, and author of the brilliant book, The War on Disabled People, talks about the high expectation placed on disabled people to kind of prove cause and effect and give evidence. And often there's a trap in making people sort of have to appear reasonable when presenting the evidence. And Ellen says, actually, the government aren't reasonable. They're violent. They create injustice. They created a system that's deliberately designed to push people into poverty because our lives are worth less to them than other people's. So there's a real trap here in this kind of presenting reasonably and assuming that the government is reasonable in return, I suppose, or will listen. So a big part then of this work, I would say, has been that actually you could see a lot of these harms and people's deaths as by design of the system rather than mistakes in the system. And that moves against appealing to the government, assuming that they're somehow ignorant or like they don't know what's happening. And if we just tell them, then they'll stop doing it and they will change. In fact, it suggests that the policies are harmful by design. And Daniel, who's wanted to remain anonymous and chose that pseudonym, but someone that we spoke to with this project, talks about the language of petitions and appeals being necessary in bringing evidence to light. But evidencing deaths doesn't curtail future deaths. All we have in this is each other to support each other. If we turn to the state to have a conscience, we'll be holding our breath for a long time. So again, around design, so many people have talked to me about this. And Tumu Johnson, who's co-director at the brilliant feminist disabled women's collective Sisters of Frida, and has been amazing, massive part of feminist organising around abolition and disability justice, says that there are ways in which the welfare state inflicts violence onto us, disabled people. That's obvious and undeniable. There's a spectrum of control. And Tumu talks about connections between different sites of violence being compounding as a repetition, a pattern, a relentlessness, which is designed to wear people down. And according to Tumu, that's a violence that is by design and is deadly. So with John Pring, we kind of looked at this, I suppose, and in making the timeline together became really conscious of this kind of slower form of violence, thinking about Rob Nixon's use of the term slow violence, but also how many other people talk about this in different contexts, a sort of violence of delayed effects of the welfare system, which exploit time and diffuse the claims of the afflicted. And often then that's used by the powerful so that repercussions can be disowned. Okay, so accountability can be denied. And we see how that kind of time is weaponized, certainly in the sense of of the UK government at the moment. And it makes cause and effect much harder to evidence and accountability much easier to avoid. And again, I won't go on and on about this, but we see when I've spoken to John as part of our podcast series, he's talked about, the government do know this. It's not a mistake. They've been told by so many people, even their own research shows about the harms of these policies, and that that they lead people to feel suicidal. So there really isn't any evidence to suggest they don't know about it, actually. And I think that shifts how we think about organising and kind of how we might use evidence with the government. And Imogen Day talks about it as state-sanctioned eugenics of disabled people because of the amounts of people that have died. It's not just human error, it's systemic. And Rick Burgess calls this democide and says it's useful to think about democide in the sense that if genocide is mass murder, then democide is mass manslaughter. It's taking away the necessary elements a human needs to survive in a society and subjecting them to absolutely inhumane conditions cumulatively. You take away their benefits, you subject them to oppressive assessments, you've demonized them in the press, and you do it repeatedly for years and years and years. When I spoke to Rick, we were like 14 years into the process, and that can't be an accident. It's not a fad, it's a cultural democide against disabled people and benefits claimants. So what does justice mean and look like then if this is by design, if this is sort of baked into the system? And I think we've seen really different understandings of justice and different understandings being held by the same people. Okay, so it's not a sort of either or, it's often an either and. Vince Laws, who's a brilliant artist activist, says the system we rely on to keep us alive seems to want us dead. We've tried petitions, letters, roadblocks, protests, reports, but they refuse to change the system that puts us in harm's way. And it brings up that old question of, can we appeal for justice to an unjust system? Welfare justice means very, very different things to people. It can come across in quite punitive ways, or more transformative, or be more state-related or abolitionist. And just to give you a sense of this then, Rick, for example, talks about for us to be able to relax in this country, we'd need to see the end of the Department for Work and Pensions and some sort of inquiry process, as well as prosecutions of some of the architects of welfare reform. And this brings up tensions around justice through the criminal justice or criminal punishment system, and also through the state. How much do we want to rely on state machinery as a journey or a path towards justice? And I think it brings up a lot of how we can learn, alongside other groups who have done this. So, for example, at the moment in the UK, there's a big people's tribunal process just started into police killings. And I think that there's so much learning to be done around kind of different forms of state violence, I think, in relation to suicides and deaths more broadly. And Imogen Day talks also about demolishing the Department for Work and Pensions, okay, and rebuilding it with disabled people at the forefront and at the heart. So there's an abolitionist strand running through this, as well as a kind of punitive sense, I would say. And I think then we need to sort of think, as I bring this to a close, inspired by abolitionists and disability justice folks like Talila Lewis, that justice means radically transforming social conditions to affirm and support all people's inherent right to live and thrive. We want to build different welfare systems and maybe think about life-affirming welfare, but it's extremely difficult to do that when all you've known is dehumanization and state abandonment. How could we imagine welfare without eligibility or deservingness, or without borders, when these things have really been foundational to the welfare that everyone has experienced? And there are total glimpses and concrete examples of alternatives to those. And very likely will not be one alternative, but of forms of mutual aid, etc., where we do see something very, very different. We see the seeds of a very different kind of welfare. And again, I think someone we spoke to, Daniel, said that so many people are reliant on the state. We need to look after these people in the duration while we build alternatives outside the state. So those are questions then about what do we need to practice to bring us closer to the futures we want and to life affirming systems, and how do our actions now foster care, community, dignity, justice and freedom. And to me, that brings up something about non-reformist reforms and welfare justice, and kind of a lot of the learning I think that we can have from the prison industrial complex, abolitionists and disability justice teachers, such as Mia Mingus, for example, to think about, what might small incremental changes that are consistent with our collective transformational demands look like in terms of a long-term vision for life-affirming infrastructures built on interdependence and the inherent value of all of our body minds. And as I just bring this to a close, I suppose I just wanted to tell you about a few things that you might find interesting, or resources, and just share that this is imperfect and in process. And we sit with a lot of questions at Healing Justice and with a lot of the other kind of groups and folks that are part of our ecosystem about trying to do research that doesn't reproduce violent bureaucracy of the welfare system or of the violent state systems that we're kind of looking at. The challenges of evidence. How can research create space to imagine beyond sort of small tweaks and reforms in a system that harms us? And also, how can research contribute to and create cross-movement solidarities? And that's something we've tried to do a lot on this project, linking up families who are bereaved by very different forms of state violence, not just by the welfare system. We've got all of our podcast series, which you're very welcome to check out and listen to. And it wouldn't be right for me not to plug the brilliant work of John Pring, my wonderful friend and co-conspirator. He wrote a brilliant book that was published last year called The Department: How a Violent Government Bureaucracy Killed Hundreds and Hid the Evidence, which is just wonderful. Please do check it out. And also, as part of Healing Justice, we have a kind of editorial platform that's relatively new, which is called In Practice, and a sort of space to dream up, imagine and rehearse some of these alternatives that I've been talking about that would render our current system redundant. And we have 3 collections at the moment that are about psych abolition, mad liberation, trans community healthcare, disability justice and assistance to live. And they're just beautiful writings and sounds and illustrations and just wonderful creative pieces that if you're interested, please do check out. And here's some resources just in case they are useful for folks. And I'll stop talking, but thank you so much for listening.
Wow, 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 wow. It's so amazing,
Nice
John.
response.
I mean, truly, what what an amazing, um, what an amazing project and wealth of wisdom, and also just like multiple sites of intervention and change and truth telling and counter narration and re-narrating. It's powerful. Um, I have a bunch of questions that I've been jotting down as you've been talking. And then I'll turn it to our small but mighty group that's with us still in person. And then I'll follow up with stuff online as people's questions come through asynchronously. But the first thing I wanted to ask you a little bit about is kind of an invitation to extend, and I'm sure this is not an uncommon point of conversation around this work, but is to extend this into conversations around medical assistance in dying,
Mm.
which is, obviously like the Canadian framing of this of the concept of physician-assisted dying, which has received significant critique, particularly in disability justice organizing and in research among disability justice advocates and activists for the ways in which governments, which are simultaneously engaging in wide-ranging austerity, are simultaneously promoting increased access to medical assistance in dying on the basis of issues surrounding the kind of category of mental health, including suicide, but also, making use of mental health as a category to substantiate a chronic long-term disability as a basis for seeking out these sorts of kinds of approaches to dying. So that is like the context that we're working with in Canada. You know, we've had legislation in the last couple of years come very close to being implemented and then was delayed recently as recently as this last year. And so I'm thinking about that because in many ways the critique is that, you know, that medical assistance in dying is becoming an expedient way for governments to actively like address the complaints about the degradation of the welfare state. But I'm also thinking about the kind of critiques around suicidist forms of knowledge production and the ways in which like we foreclose on the meaning of deaths and what they bear witness to by in a sense like pathologizing and also limiting the unconditional right to die. So I don't know if there's a clear question there, but I was just wondering if you had thoughts given the kind of intersection of this question of austerity as it relates to like the different ways that neoliberal governments are solutioning the critique. If you see
Yeah.
that as connected here in your work in any way.
Yeah, thank you so much. And very much. I mean, we also just, I think it was either very late last year or the beginning of this year, had a bill passed on assisted dying. There's still a long way for that to go in terms of kind of coming into being. There's a lot of resistance to that, and a lot of disabled people's resistance to it. And I think a lot of that has been informed by an understanding of what's happening in Canada and what happened. So that's quite, I think, familiar to certainly a lot of activists. And there's a big crossover, I would say, in you know, a lot of groups like Disabled People Against Cuts. I don't know about their stance as a whole, but certainly a lot of people who are part of those kinds of groups also have been very vocal in terms of resisting and protesting assisted dying or assisted suicide, as it looks like in the context of austerity. And a lot of that framing has been, in fact, the in practice thing I just shared with Healing Justice. One of the themes was assistance to live, and that's because there has been that framing of like, give us assistance to live, rather than passing this bill around assisted dying.
Yeah.
And I think, yes, it does. So, and we also see that in it. It's just wild because we also have a context of if people are sort of visibly suicidal in public, they're criminalized for it in the UK and fined money for it. So just, yeah, there's a lot of things crossing over around lives worth living and suicidality and massive cuts to the mental health system. And again, that puts us in a difficult position because a lot of those services weren't great anyway, but they were the only thing that people may have had. So you kind of find yourself fighting against cuts to something that wasn't a great thing in the first place, but you don't want it to go entirely.
For sure. Yeah.
So I can really hear this in the context of austerity. It's very, very, very similar here. I think there's also something that I've thought a lot about and really kind of guided, I would say, by people like you. Are you coming up? Okay, give me 1 second. Sorry. Are you right? Okay.
She's just very upset. Sorry.